first of all, let me start with 3 statements about software architecture. I've skipped the definition and all that part. I really want to highlight some of the things that I consider important and that I believe not everybody shares. So maybe most of you, but possibly not everybody. So that's why I want to spend some time about these introductory things. So first of all, I think that architecture is not something that you do at the beginning of a project, right? Architecture is not that thing that every sane developer hates, where some people who don't know what they're actually doing tell you how you should do everything without knowing the details and the challenges and the context that you're in. I think architecture is not something that you do at the beginning to define the groundwork and then everybody has to follow the great plan of the grand architect. I think that's an old-fashioned view. And similarly to something like the waterfall method of software development, it's something that nobody ever really wanted to do. It just turned out that way, and maybe some people would have liked to be in that position. But I think that even when people tried doing an architecture at the beginning, it turned out not to work that way, right? Because you always discover the flaws and the problems with your architecture during the actual project work, where you find out where you went wrong and made assumptions that didn't hold. So that's my first statement. The second one is that architecture is not documentation. Architecture is not a concept. Architecture does not mean that somebody has to do this optional thing, right? Architecture is something that you always have. It's a property of the system that you're designing, or the system that you have built, right? It is something that that a system exposes. It means the important structural aspects of your system, right? And with that said, architecture is something that you can't judge without context, right? So you have to consider the architecture in the context of the requirements and of the situation you are in, right? So if an architecture is good for one party, for one context, for one company, that does not mean at all that it's useful and reasonable in another context. You really have to judge it based on what it is that you want to achieve and how well it actually does that. So with that said, I've decided, or some of my colleagues and I have decided to collect some of the antipatterns, right? And you will notice that this is going to be a very, very crowded slide. I will not be able to let you see everything what I meant, but that doesn't really matter. I'm not going to go over all of those things. I just want to give you an impression of all of the things that we've collected over the course of time. Things that we've considered as antipatterns that happen again and again when people do software architecture work, right? And I will dive into some of those. We are actually planning to publish a website that has a collection of small essays of patterns and examples of where they happen. And maybe you can take a guess at what some of those mean when I look at vendor-driven architecture or golf course peer pressure. I'm sure that many of those who work for large companies have actually seen something like this in one form or the other. Of those patterns, I've actually picked a few and I've decided to illustrate what happens with them with a few cases, right? So that's what I'm gonna be talking about for most of the talk. I will look at some actual cases where we found ourselves in situations where architecture had gone wrong, where architecture work was either not there at all and you had to deal with the architecture that emerged, or where it just went wrong because people made bad decisions at some point in time. And let me also point that out, because some people who watch this talk maybe later on will recognize or think they recognize the systems I'm talking about, right? I'm very convinced that most of the time those decisions have been made, or in general are made with the best intentions, right? People want to do good things. They want to do what's right, at least most of the time. They want to do something that they consider to be the best solution, the best approach at this particular scenario. And when you find out that it is a mess, that may well be because the context has changed, or because some assumptions that you rightly made turned out to be wrong and you just couldn't have known that. So hindsight is very, very easy. And I think it's very important to make that point, because I'm not judging people. I'm not judging the humans who make those decisions. It's just that sometimes the mess that things turn into is just too funny to ignore, and I love to talk about that. So let me talk about those cases and start with the first one. This anti-pattern we call non-extensible extensibility, and that is something that you can see happening a lot of times. So in this particular scenario, the context was that we were working for an e-commerce retail provider. So this was a company that essentially built shops for other companies to sell stuff to their end users, to their customers, right? So it was like a multi-tenant platform that helped to provide stuff to a global customer base. So one of the positive things about this company, which still exists, was that it had a lot of knowledge of how to do business all over the world. It knew all of the customs rules, all of the tax rules. It had localizations for all of the different languages, and it knew all of the weird rules that you have to follow when you go from one country to the other and ship certain kinds of goods. So that was its knowledge, that was its expertise, and that's what it sold to its clients, right? So it had like a catalog and shop and fulfillment system to offer to its clients, who then could offer their goods to their clients, right? So obviously it was a multi-tenant system, sort of the white label kind of stuff that you see in other industries as well. And this one is one that probably everybody knows pretty well. Now, one of the key things here was that this thing was highly customizable, right? So for obvious reasons, when you offer something with this white label concept, that essentially means that you're offering something that's very, well, white, very clean. It's not labeled, it's not branded. So you could brand it as a client. You could add your own colors and logos, but you could also add like things like your own custom fonts, or maybe even your own screens, your own texts, and sometimes even your own business processes, right? You could turn this into your shop. Your end user experience mattered, or the end user experience that your clients had was very important to you if you were a client of this client of ours, right? So what they actually ended up doing was something that made a lot of sense when you looked at it. And that was, they actually, I have to get a bit out of the way here. They actually had, if you look at this graph, they had a number of different clients. The clients were sitting at different ends of the spectrum, right? So you go from very generic to very specific, and you also have very low versus very high budgets that people were actually willing to invest into the whole thing. So imagine you had a number of clients who were very, very large. So those were large strategic customers. A large strategic customer has very, very high customization needs, right? They wanted to get things exactly right. And they also had a lot of money. So a few of those clients of our client made up for like 20 to 30% of their overall revenue, right? So it's like 2 or 3 clients making a third of the revenue. Then you had a number of long tail clients. Those were all the little small clients, small customers who only had very modest needs and only very limited budget, right? Those might be small shops, small companies that actually sold something. They had also had customization needs, but they weren't as sophisticated. They weren't as specific. Now, what the company had built here over the course of maybe a decade or so, definitely multiple years, was a highly, highly sophisticated customization system. It was so sophisticated, you actually had to download an actual IDE to customize the shop. It was an Eclipse-based IDE, had a download of about 1 gig that you had to install and then learn how to use to actually customize your shopping experience on that particular platform. And as you can imagine, this sort of was a little too much for the long tail clients, right? The clients who only had very modest needs, they just wanted to change a few colors and maybe tweak a few texts and add a logo or something, but they had to download this gigantic IDE and had to learn how to use it, which of course they didn't bother to do. So essentially for our client, it meant that, well, they had to actually do the work. They had to use their own customization solution for those clients and offer that as a service, which made those little clients unhappy because they now had to pay for professional services, even though their demands were very limited. On the other side of the spectrum, you had the large-scale customers who had very sophisticated demands, which often just simply couldn't be met by this fancy customization solution, because at some point in time you hit the wall with customization solutions, right? There are some things that you didn't think about when you made them customizable, so you would have to tweak and do something. So they had to add something to the tool, which meant that they ended up being the ones who used the tools again themselves, right? So the customization tool was, in fact, if you considered it, built for somebody in the middle, which essentially meant it was built for no one. They essentially had no client who was happy with the customization system. They had invested dozens of person years, and they had created lots of complexity without any good reason. And that is something that I've seen happen over and over again, right? You see people creating something that actually is very, very complicated to demand a need that is simply not there. And that's a little sad, right? Because you've done so much work with so little return. The lesson I draw from this is that essentially when you aim to satisfy too many people, you actually end up satisfying no one, right? So the thinking of something very specific here would have helped a lot in this particular scenario. And highly specific code, something that you create for some very specific situation, is often preferable. So if you think of that graph that I just showed, that clients, those few clients that were strategic, they would absolutely have justified creating something in actual code just for them, which would have meant that the team doing that would have been able to use general purpose tools. They could have used their favorite IDE. Imagine that if you are, I don't know, a Scala developer, Java developer, .NET developer, somebody forces you to use some crappy tool with some programming language that you've never heard of, simply because that is the customization solution. You will be very unhappy. In fact, you will probably not do it. You will look for another job, which actually is something that happened to a lot of the knowledgeable people there, right? So doing something highly specific is often preferable to sophisticated configuration. In fact, I could consider sophisticated configuration the anti-pattern here, right? Because every configuration language that becomes powerful becomes an actual general purpose programming language and then has to compete with all of the other very good options out there in the market. So that's my first case. The second one is perilously fine granularity. And that is something that I've seen a lot happening these days, specifically with microservices architectures. And of course, these days it's all the rage to, talk badly about microservices, which is not something that I want to do. I'm actually still a big fan of that whole approach. I like my microservices a little bigger, and I like them to not only be services. So maybe I'm the wrong person to talk about that, but the general ideas I still like a lot. And if you want to, we can talk a little about my favorite way of doing things at the end. But let me dive into this little example here. So we're looking at a large-scale B2B food retailer. It doesn't matter that much, but that was a very large company with a lot of structure in the organization and a lot of different stakeholders and all of the complexities and politics that you have in a huge business. I'm sure many of you will be able to relate to that. If you work in a large organization, organizational politics become a very, very important issue. What they decided to do was to build a new company-wide solution to essentially, replace almost all of the commercial off-the-shelf systems that they had in the past and all of the crappy solutions that they built. They really wanted to go all in and build something really, really good from scratch. They wanted to do everything right. They have a huge program, more than 200 developers. I think it was 300 at the peak. So a pretty big effort, the whole thing. And what they ended up doing was they followed the good advice that everybody has for you right now, which is you cut things up into a lot of small pieces, right? Because that's obviously a very good idea. Now, a problem with that is that if you look at those small pieces, then they do things that multiple people are interested in, right? So let's say you have this team over here that's responsible for this particular stuff here, right? Then that team will be able to satisfy certain needs of stakeholders, right? If a stakeholder wants to do something, then they go to this team and that team will have to change those services to achieve that need. Now, of course, another team might have some overlap with them, right? You might actually end up sharing one of those services and then you'll have to figure out who gets to change what in what order. And of course, you can draw a lot of those things and you can see that there's potentially a lot of overlap between those things. And then you get a lot of the problems that you associate with big organizational projects, which is you'll have to have meetings there to decide who does what when. And you'll have to do some release planning to make sure you don't step on each other's toes, right? That is, to me, I think the saddest version of a microservices architecture that you can have, because it essentially ignores what to me is one of the major reasons to have one in the first place, which is independence of individual teams, right? You want those teams to work within their own boundaries. You don't want them to step on each other's toes all the time, which is exactly what happened here. So the problem, in my view here, is that the stakeholders weren't taken into account. The stakeholders who drive the needs for the teams to do something determine what good boundaries are, or at least to a large degree, they do that. Now, if you look at that in examples, then the case is almost always this order service. I'd really like to later, or maybe now, see a show of hand if any of you have an order service that gives you problems. Because it's almost funny, because it doesn't really matter what domain I'm in, it's almost always the order service, whether it's a retail service, a B2B solution, some banking, it doesn't really matter, right? Everybody has this kind of service. And the problem with that service is that it's entity-centric. It's centered around the idea of having an order. This particular example could be a customer or whatever it is that is the most important entity within your system as the core defining factor of one particular service. So you end up having lots of different aspects from different domains or contexts addressed with this particular service. And that, I've tried to encode that here with the little colors, right? So you essentially have all of those different things like the checkout and support, the fulfillment, the billing, whatever it is, all depending on this one particular service. So of course they step on each other's toes, right? Of course you have lots of people fighting about what to do when with that particular service. Now, that is something that I've seen a lot of times, and I think it's definitely an anti-pattern in microservices in their own right. It's sort of the entity anti-pattern. But it's also, I think, an organizational thing, because you can see that happening in other architectural scenarios as well. So why would you end up doing that? Why would you cut up your system into those little fragments, right? Maybe the color gives you a hint. Does anybody have any idea what I'm referring to here? What's the number one reason people use that particular version of architecture? Anybody here? Okay. So does that help in any way? I think Netflix, which is a fantastic company that does a fantastic job, and I'm a big fan, I'm a consumer of theirs. I'm also a big fan of their architectural ideas and the way they do things. I think they really have a bad influence here, because so many people take what Netflix does as their role model, right? They look at the Netflix architecture, and then they see all of these tiny little microservices, and they think, well, that is obviously how you do things these days, right? Well, you have to cut things up into very small pieces, because then you're going to end up with a good architecture. Now, the problem is that almost everybody wants to be like them, but almost nobody is, right? I mean, if you're running a video portal for a few 100 million people, then maybe, and I'm only saying maybe because I'm not 100% convinced, but maybe Netflix's architecture is a good choice for you. But chances are that's not what you're doing. Maybe you're building a banking app, maybe you're in an insurance company, maybe you're building an e-commerce application or a shop system for whatever it is. It's quite unlikely, to be frank, that you'll have a few 100 million users. Apologies to those of you who do. And it's highly unlikely that you're a Netflix competitor and would benefit from having the same architecture. And again, I'm not even sure Netflix benefits from it that much. I think there might be some discussion worth having there as well, but let's just assume Netflix is perfect in their architecture. That still doesn't mean it's a good architectural choice for anybody else. Now, just to finish this little example here, right? So to me, the right way to approach this stuff would be to look at this particular thing here and decide where stuff actually belongs. And very often you'll find out that it's much better to have those things put close to the stuff where it's needed, right? So as opposed to having those little things centralized in this order service, you actually distribute them to the actual places where they belong, and then you can simply do away with this thing. So fewer services and having larger things and maybe even some redundancy might be a much better choice for your particular scenario. Again, very much depends on the context. I'm not saying this is always the better architecture. I'm just pointing out that context matters, and you have to find out what's the best way for you to do things. Okay. Okay, I'm not able to answer that question in passing. You'll have to discuss it yourself. So I'm just adding, not everything that's popular is automatically useful, right? So if something is a topic that's in high demand at a conference, that means that it's probably worth looking into, and maybe you should look into it. If everybody's talking about that particular thing, maybe it's worth a closer look. But that alone is not a justification for you to put it in your actual architecture for your actual current system, right? So consider that popularity alone is not the best architectural driver. Conference-driven development or CV-driven development is something that you should probably avoid. And don't copy somebody else's architecture unless you're sure the context is identical, right? So be wary of that. Even people like me, I mean, every speaker has their stories, right? They talk about something, but of course they only pick the stories that support their narrative, right? So just simply take everything with a grain of salt and just assume that you will have to make your own choices and pick from all of the options something that works best for your particular situation. Hype-driven development, yes, that's also, HDD is also a very good acronym for that particular thing. Okay. Let me get to my case number 3, and it might well be that I'll leave it at that. We'll see how far I get. So that is what I call the horizontal Conway split. So I don't have a slide on Conway's law. By now I assume that basically everybody knows it, but just to give you a very, very quick summary, Conway's law essentially says that organization and architecture are intertwined, right? You can't have an architecture that doesn't somehow reflect the organization. You can turn that around and say that architecture always influences the organization. So my example here is something that's dear to my heart, which is the standard split in many software teams these days, which I think is just wrong. Again, most of the time, not always, but most of the time. So for context, we do have a lot of clients that are startups, small companies who can basically do whatever they want, but we also have very, very big clients. And we have a lot of companies somewhere in the middle. That might be a bank or an insurance company that wants to do something really cool and sets up this, dedicated group of people who build some new business model. Or it might be a startup that has grown into something that has a lot of people and needs to support growth in a different way. So there's a lot of variety here. But something we see very often is that case that I'm not describing in this particular scenario, but again, it's generalizable, right? So in this case, it was a unified communication platform, a solution that was supposed to address a need for people to communicate using different channels with a single system. Doesn't really matter that much. Pretty much straightforward business logic. That was not the critical thing, right? It was more about how to get a great UX, how to build something that people would love to use than something that has a lot of complications internally. It was not, driven by tax law or complicated products. Pretty much a straightforward product. But it had super high scaling requirements, right? So you wanted to do something that had a lot of scalability to support a high number of concurrent users, right? So it was 1 or 2 teams, which I think was a good choice, not too many people, 10 or 20 developers, also a reasonable size, not one of those 200 or 300 people projects that we sometimes work with. And one of the situations it had was this one, which I think is very common these days. So you had 2 groups of people, and they were really quite distinct. They were part of different communities. Right? You had the people who very strongly felt that Java is a little bit like the COBOL of these days, right? That is something that cool people no longer use. I mean, that's technology for old people with gray beards, right? That is not something reasonably hip and cool people use anymore. I mean, those cool people might have beards as well, but they're probably not as gray. So the one group of people really considered Java to be a legacy thing, while the other group of people basically just thought anybody who voluntarily chooses JavaScript and even calls it a programming language has just not understood how any of this stuff works, right? And I'm in neither of those groups. I'm very open to both, but in many projects, I see this as a very clear distinction between people. Now, most projects, well, of course, there are a lot of projects that don't do Java, but you possibly can replace this with C# or whatever your not so super hip programming language of choice is. In many of those cases, people still recognize that you might need both, right? So for example, you might have a huge Java code base, or you might have a lot of systems to connect to, or you simply might have, that is the #1 reason, a lot of people who know Java and fewer people who know JavaScript. So what happens? What does Conway's law tell us will happen? I think this is sort of a variation of Conway's law. It's more of a community-driven Conway's law thing, which means that in most of the cases where you have something like this, this turns into the front end and this turns into the back end group, which is really significant because you've just taken, the feeling of belonging that people have and turned that into a major architectural decision. I mean, this is a significant decision. You have those 2 things. Now you have a JSON API in the middle, right? You've decided to cut your system, a apart along this horizontal line. And that is almost always a very bad decision because you can't get stuff done. Nobody in any of those groups can get stuff done. You now have two teams. One of them can only do front-end stuff. One of the teams can only do back-end stuff. And that is going to hurt you a lot. I'm aware it's a common architecture. That doesn't make it a good architecture, right? So what I've seen happening in those situations, is that everything meaningful requires collaboration. So essentially you have meetings all the time, you have discussions all the time, and one group always has to wait for the other one. Typically the front-end group has to wait for the back-end people, which only furthers their belief that Java is a completely useless programming language because they always take so long to build anything. And the Java people say, well, these kids, they're just there to make things pretty. I don't know why they just can't take our beautiful services and just write the application for some definition of just. So this really creates tension between those groups in reinforcing the boundaries that they have, right? Now, one of the consequences is that those front-end teams very often become secret full-stack teams, right? So they start doing things on their own. They start, building things in a quicker way from their perspective, at least, because it takes them too long to wait for the back-end people, right? So that is not a good consequence. What I'm suggesting is that there's no limit to the architectural complexity people will accept if it means they can stay within their own boundaries. I'm very negative here, right? This is not always the case, of course. But I think when we make an architectural choice based on that, belonging to certain groups, we end up with something that is suboptimal. We end up with something that could have been better simply because we accept those boundaries instead of questioning whether they're useful or not. And I think it's much more useful to have sort of full stack teams, not saying full stack developers, because there are very, very, very few people who really deserve that label, who really are full stack developers from UX and CSS and HTML down to all of the layers until maybe the nitty-gritty bits of a SQL database optimization strategy. That is really a very rare thing. They exist, but they're very rare. But what does exist and what's a useful thing is teams that are full stack, right? A single team that can deliver something end to end from the front end to the back end with all of the things in between is much better than having those team boundaries along those front end and back end lines. Now, I promised that I wanted to leave some room for discussion. I have two more cases, but I will simply skip them and jump right to my conclusions so that we can have some more discussion at the end, okay? And hopefully you can see my takeaways now. So the first one that I have from all of these things is, I think architecture is not something to be afraid of. I've seen agile teams, specifically agile teams, sort of being afraid that if they talk this architecture thing, they're doing something that is contrary to the agile ideas. That is not at all the case. If you want to deliver something useful, then architecture is something that you have to consider. Doesn't mean that you have to have somebody who's labeled an architect, not at all. Just means that you need to consider your architecture explicitly unless you're willing to live with the one that emerges. And that's very often not a very good idea. The second thing is, you should choose the simplest thing that could possibly work. I didn't have the case to support that, but it's probably a useful thing, right? I'm not at all suggesting that, for example, for the customization case, you should go to one of the extremes, right? Don't build something that is super customizable for everyone and super complex. That'll hurt you in the end. Nor build something that is so stupid that it'll break down the first challenge, right? So pick something that is the simplest thing that'll work, but take into account what's going to happen in the future. Creating evolvable structures is something that I found very important and very, very, very useful in the long run, right? So build something that allows you to grow over the course of time within your project. Manage your system's architectural evolution is another thing that I didn't have the case to support right now, which is that you'll have to address the fact that your system's requirements will change over the course of time, and you have to be able to introduce new architectural concepts. Architecture is the stuff that's hard to change, so it's hard to come up with a good way of doing that, but it essentially means you have to consider it. You can't just ignore it. You can't just hope for the best here. You have to be very explicit about those things. And if you happen to be an architect, if that is the label that's attached to you, then my advice to you is, just don't create bottlenecks, right? Don't create roadblocks. Don't be the one who everybody else has to wait on. Just be somebody who helps and gets out of the way as quickly as possible, because I really strongly believe that motivation comes from those cross-functional teams that can deliver something end to end. So it's sort of the principle of having decisions, of allowing decisions to be made at the level closest to the actual problem, at the level where the actual work happens, as much as that is possible. Because if you have very few rules, it's much easier to get people to adhere to them, and that is very important. So that is, I think, all I have right now. Thanks for listening so far, and now I'm trying to make sense of the stuff that you wrote into the chat.